good evening or good very late evening if you're watching from out of state or out of country. My name's Andrea and I am working here on the marketing team at the Strand. We're very happy to see all of you tonight, but before we launch into our discussion with Adam, we'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand if you don't know about us already. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place in New York City, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by a third-generation owner, Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support, for attending these events and continuing to purchase your books from us. We know without our loyal book community, we wouldn't be where we are today. Tonight, we're excited to have with us Adam Rutherford, who will be discussing his latest book, How to Argue with a Racist. Adam is a geneticist, a science writer, and a broadcaster. He studied genetics at University College London, and during his PhD on the developing eye, he was part of a team that identified the first known genetic cause for a form of childhood blindness. As well as writing for the science pages of The Guardian, he has written and presented many award-winning series and programs for the BBC, including the flagship weekly Radio 4 program Inside Science, The Cell for BBC 4, and Playing God on the rise of synthetic biology and the leading science series Horizon. He is also the author of How to Argue with a Racist, The Book of Humans, which is an evolutionary history that explores the profound paradox of the human animal, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, which is a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Nonfiction, and Creation, The Origin of Life in Synthetic Biology, which was shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize. And now, without further ado, Adam Rutherford. Oh, one moment.
Got it.
Yay!
Sorry, I just couldn't find the unmute button, but thank you so much for that introduction. So hi to everyone. So the last time I was in New York I was presenting at the Strand in person. Unfortunately, we can't do that this time round, but it's I suppose this is the next best thing. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about my new book, which came out this week in America, How to Argue with a Racist. It was published in the UK in February, in that ancient time ago where everything was completely different in the world and none of the things that have happened since had happened. So this is not simply a new version of that for this book for the American market. It isn't just that we've changed all the words favorite for favorite and color for color. It has a new full introduction which talks about some of the issues that have emerged in the last 6 months, and is very much focused on the American experience of racism as it relates to science. Of course, I'm going to be talking about some pretty sensitive issues, so a lot of this comes with sensitivity warnings, and hopefully I'll be able to alert when those sorts of things are going to come up. I think the format is I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes. I've got lots of slides to get through, so I'll get on with that. So yes, as was just said, I am a geneticist, I'm a writer, and but I've been a geneticist for 25 years now, mostly at University College London, where I am based. So that means that I deal in evolution, I deal in DNA, and deal in genes. But in the last few years, and especially in the last book 1, which was called A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, a lot of my work in the last few years has been about race and eugenics and the sort of quintessential relationship between those ideas and the role that science has historically played in the invention of race and the enactment of eugenics policies all over the world. So if you are a geneticist, and I can see from the list on the right-hand side that there are a couple of actual geneticists from New York and Kansas, people I know, colleagues like Jenny Raff in the room, hi people. If you are a geneticist, you talk about genomes, you talk about human variation, it is inevitable that you cannot not talk about race and the fact that race is a social construct. It doesn't have any roots in biological classification as we understand human variation in the 20th century. We'll be talking a bit about that in a bit. And I suppose, in a sense, this is a sort of unfortunate direction for my work, for the discussion of human genetics. I'm just going to now just share my screen with you so you can see some of my slides. Hold on just a sec. And I'll do that like this. So there you go. So this is the cover of the book, which has just come out in the States this week. So yes, this has been a sort of, you know, a direction that people go into science not to follow these sorts of discussions about race, about eugenics, but actually to study science and study the nature of human variation and our evolution. But it is sort of inevitable because we've seen a lot of things changing in the last few years. We've seen the changing political atmosphere all around the world, the rise of populism and nationalism in both the States with the election of Donald Trump, and in the UK with the advent of Brexit. Now, what that means is that you've got the propulsion of discussions about race suddenly they're right back in the public discourse in a way that I don't remember them being like this in any time in my adult life. We've also seen a sort of a huge growth and maturation in the study of human genetics. So 20 years ago, 2 weeks ago was the anniversary of the first draft of the Human Genome Project, which sort of was a landmark in setting up the future landscape of this research into human DNA. And there's been a matching interest in popular discussions about genetics, which is fantastic, because we want to talk about our subject as much as possible, because it is the subject that underwrites pretty much all biology. There was something else that occurred in the last sort of 10 years or so, which I don't think anyone in the genetics community really predicted, which is the enormity of the commercial genetics market. So these are companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com and a few others that have emerged and become enormously popular. And I take a pretty dim view of these types of products, but nevertheless, they are part of the popular discourse on genetics right now. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. And then, of course, I wrote this book over the last 2 years, you know, based on 20 years worth of studying this subject, recognizing that the culture was changing somewhat and that this discussion was becoming more and more part of the public discourse, but with no recognition of the significant events of 2020. And so the two key global events have been the emergence of this pandemic that we are still in, and then not long after that, the killing, the murder of George Floyd, which kicked off a new wave of race demonstrations all around the world, and the prominence of Black Lives Matter. Now, the racialization of COVID is a big part of this current discussion about race in the public discourse, and it's been racialized in two specific, discrete ways. The first is that the origin of the virus, which was in the Wuhan wet market, as far as we understand it currently, resulted in just specific racialized attacks on mostly Chinese Americans, but also significantly in Korean Americans, to the extent that more than, I think, 3,000 have been documented. It has its own Wikipedia page, and we've seen this all around the world. A student from my own university was brutally, savagely beaten on Oxford Street, which is not far from where I'm sitting right now, back in February. So that was the first racialization of COVID. And the second was that we have seen, since early in the infection, in the pandemic in March, we have seen the fact that the risk of infection and indeed death is much higher in Black and Asian British people and in Black, Asian and Hispanic or Latinx Americans. Now, as soon as this happened, I started getting emails from people saying, doesn't this demonstrate the biological validity of race, the fact that these groups of people were more likely to be infected and more likely to die from this disease, which of course it did no such thing. In fact, we can almost completely explain the disparity in infection for Black and Asian and Latino people via socioeconomic factors that are really well understood because they're not unique to COVID at all, rather than some sort of an inherent biological racialization of the specific virus. So this is where we're at. We're now at a point where race is part of the public discourse at levels that are way beyond simply the discussion of the fundamentals of race, the history of race, and the racialization of biology, which has occurred over the last several hundred years. Now, when I say that race is a social construct rather than a biological one, this is a really important point, because this is the temptation by well-meaning people, non-racist people, anti-racist people, to say that race does not exist is not useful nor true. Race very much does exist because it is a social construct. And sometimes you come across the argument, or sometimes you find people saying that that race is just or merely a social construct. Now, this is also a somewhat absurd thing to say, because social interactions make up the vast majority of human interactions. You have biological interactions with very, very few people during the duration of your life. So social interactions, social constructs are incredibly important. Time is a social construct. Money is a social construct. You don't get people saying, I'm not going to pay you, or I'm going to turn up late to something, because time or money are simply or merely social constructs. And in the same way, saying that race is a social construct does not undermine its significance. Race absolutely exists because it is a social construct, and racism exists because we enact it. The fact that it does not tally with our biological understanding in the 21st century of human variation, that is what we mean when we say that race is not biologically meaningful at all. Now, the book itself it's short, it's punchy, it's kind of pugnacious, and this is all intentional, and it's broken up into just 4 chapters in which I discuss emblematic ideas within key areas of the discussion of the relationship between science and race, and they are on the screen now: the origin of race, the concept of racial purity, race and sport, and race and intelligence. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to whip through just a couple of these. I'm going to talk about racial purity and race and sport. The origin of race, I will touch upon that, but that is the sort of history of this subject, the invention of race during European expansionism, the era of colonialization, a time when science is being, or pseudoscience in fact, is being co-opted or marshaled into justifying political ideologies. Race and intelligence is probably the most contentious and tricky subject in the whole of science, arguably, and warrants its own lectures, of which I have a series of lectures that I teach to undergraduates at UCL on this specific topic. And I haven't found a way to get into this in 15 to 20 minutes for a public audience. So maybe if this comes up in the questions, I can talk about specific issues. And by the way, I've got a puppy sleeping next to me who's only 4 months old, and hopefully will stay asleep during the whole of the next 45 minutes and not tear the place up. But I can't guarantee that. So I'm going to talk about race and sport first. And I recognize that not everyone is into sport. I am. But one of the reasons that I think sport is important in this discussion is because historically and today, it is one of the ways that we have seen the abilities of people all around the world. Many of the myths and stereotypes which have a pseudoscientific root to them are based around how we see and how we perceive elite athletes doing sporting events. Last week was the anniversary of one of the greatest achievements in sporting history, which is when Jesse Owens, James Cleveland Owens, as his full name was, took 4 gold medals at the Olympics. And even better than that, it was the Berlin Olympics. It was 1936. He literally did this in front of Hitler. This is one of the most powerful photos, I think, in history. This is one of the photos in the book itself. There's Jesse saluting next to thousands of people doing the Nazi salute. Now, what an astonishing achievement this is. And by the way, after Owens took these 4 goals, Hitler did actually shake Jesse Owens' hand. It was FDR who rebutted him on the grounds that he was never invited to the White House after the Olympics. It was only the white athletes who had a presidential invitation. Now, racist beliefs about African Americans in sports people at this time are very prevalent. The enormous significance of this achievement by Jesse Owens in 1936 is massively undermined by a comment by his own coach, who said this: "The Negro excels in the events he does because he is closer to the primitive than the white man. It was not long ago that his ability to sprint and jump was a life and death matter to him in the jungle." You know, an unequivocally racist sentiment by Jesse Owens' own coach. Now, this was said by Cromwell in the 1950s, a few years later. I want to skip forward in time to talk about, just mention, well, my own favorite athlete of all time. I love track and field, and Michael Johnson is literally my favorite athlete of all time. Here he is in Atlanta, where he won the 200 and the 400, never achieved before, and was injured, so didn't compete in the 4x100. Now, you know, he's unequivocally one of the greatest sprinters in the modern age. But in 2012, he was in part of the commentating team for the Olympics in London. What a great Olympics they were too. And part of this documentary that was made about him as in the lead up to the Olympics themselves was a sort of version of Roots, or Who Do You Think You Are, for Michael Johnson, in which they looked at his West African heritage via genetic tests. This is a few years ago, so the technology wasn't quite as advanced as it is today. And he was, as part of this journey, he was learning about the brutality of transatlantic slavery. And he made the following comment: "All my life, I believe I became an athlete through my own determination, but it's impossible to think that being descended from slaves hasn't left an imprint through the generations. Difficult as it was to hear, slavery has benefited descendants like me. I believe there is a superior athletic gene in us." Now, I remember him saying this and thinking, oh, that's kind of tragic, because one, it's scientifically incorrect, for reasons that I go into in details in the book. But secondly, it has the effect of hugely undermining the personal success. That first sentence, that his own determination was not the thing that made him one of the greatest athletes of all time. It's worth scrutinizing this as an argument, because, well, there is some evidence for genetic differences in African Americans compared to Africans, and this is due to the history of slavery, the history of 12 million people being forcibly taken from their homes, largely from 5 West African countries, and being forcibly mixed in the Americas. And so we see differences in the African American genome that specifically relate to characteristics like diseases such as hypertension or prostate or bladder cancer, scleroses, and conditions such as sickle cell. But the truth of the matter is there isn't really a very sound explanation for this putative evolutionary change over such a short period of time, which has bred a superior athletic gene, as Michael Johnson said in 2012, into African Americans, and that this, as is often the case, is used to justify or to explain the dominance of African American men, specifically in short distance sprinting, running, and certain athletic events in other sports. There is many details to go into in that, and I don't think that this time is the right time to do that, especially to look very closely at the genetics. But one thing which is worth saying is that in the largest assessment of the African American genome, such that is a somewhat non-specific term to use to describe 40-odd million people, we don't see the latest evidence based on sampling something like 29,000 African Americans. We don't actually see any evidence of selection for any specific genes at all. There are differences on average between African American genes and European American descended genomes, DNA. But in terms of there being selection, so the hallmark of evolutionary selection, whether it is natural or in the case of fugitively during transatlantic slavery enforced, we don't see any selection for any genes whatsoever. So this is, based on the latest science, is fundamentally untrue. It's an unsound thing to say. But, you know, even if it were true, let's just sort of speculate about this. You know, maybe there is no evidence for it, but maybe selection does account for a biological overrepresentation of African American athletic success compared to the populations from which they were taken, i.e. West Africans. So we leave aside the fact that there is no evidence for that. Let's leave aside the fact that there is the generational time over 300 or 400 years is not really enough to see the fixation of genes associated with athletic success in that time. Let's park those things for one point. If it were the case that there was an inherent biological factor that was specific to African Americans, and this did account for the success of African Americans in specific sports, it does not account for the fact that it is very specific sports where we see this. So, for example, if there is selection for genes which are associated with explosive energy sports such as sprinting, as befits someone like Michael Johnson or Carl Lewis or Usain Bolt, then why do we not see an equivalent dominance of African Americans in other sports that require the same sort of explosive energy, such as, I don't know, squash, which is dominated by athletes from India or Pakistan or Egypt or Great Britain? We don't see any African American sprint cyclists at the elite level. And the very fact that there is enormous disparity and inequity in the distribution of success at elite level in African Americans compared to any racialized group is perhaps best exemplified by the fact that the absolute dominance of African Americans in the last 40 years in sprint running has not been matched at all by the presence of African Americans in short distance swimming. In fact, there have only been 2 African Americans, or indeed Africans, in the history of the Olympics, shown on the slide here, Cullen Jones and Simone Manuel. Now, this plays to one of the most prevalent stereotypes and myths associated with sporting prowess, and associated with people of recent African descent, which is this notion that Black people don't swim, or possibly can't swim. And this has been biologized for decades by the completely false notion that there is a biological buoyancy factor, which is absent due to denser bones in Black people than in Europeans. Now, it is as nonsensical as it sounds, but it is believed by so many people, and tragically, it's believed by many Black people. I have friends here in London, one specific friend who is a heart surgeon in one of the top hospitals, who said it to me. He said, well, we don't swim because we have denser bones. Now, it is simply untrue. It's a sort of bastardization of a slight piece of evidence about osteoporosis, which relates to bone density, but that was drawn from actuary data in the States. And really, there is no evidence that Black people have denser bones, and if they did, that this relates to buoyancy. In fact, what we know about swimming and African Americans is that 70%, this is based on data from Swim America, 70% of African Americans don't swim, compared to 30% of white Americans who don't swim. And when Swim America a few years ago, about a decade ago, surveyed the reasons that they could find that accounted for the fact that you have this massive difference between swimming proficiency in African Americans compared to European descended Americans, what they found is that all of the reasons were socioeconomic and none of them were biological. So in reverse order, an absence of role models was one. We've just seen that in the previous slide. Access to pools was another. So when segregation officially ended in '64, most new pools were built in predominantly white areas, and so access to pools was restricted for Black people. Economic reasons, so swim schools tend to be extracurricular and therefore are associated with socioeconomic status. The second most significant reason was having parents or friends who don't swim. But most obviously, and I think it kind of breaks my heart because this is so obvious and just so completely transparently obvious as soon as you say it, that the main reason was not being taught how to swim. People who don't swim haven't been taught how to swim. And it's nothing to do with some mythological, legendary buoyancy factor that relates to bone density. Now, it's sort of comical, this, until you find out that the drowning rate for African-American children aged between 8 and 14 is 3 times higher than it is for European-descended Americans. So this is a kind of structural and biologized racism, which is literally lethal. It is a literal lethal account of structural racism in America and elsewhere. This is not unique to America. So this is why sport and the physicality of racism is important in this discussion. It's just before I move on to talk about racial purity, I just want to finish this area about thinking about how we think about sport and how we think about race, because specifically to do with African Americans and African people in general, there is a very, very predominant theme which is utterly baked into our culture, which is derived from hundreds of years of pseudoscientific classification of Africans, particularly sub-Saharan Africans, which is to do with the physical body being more significant in the prowess of African or African descended people compared to Europeans. Now, if that sounds ridiculous, an account of this was published in the academic literature 2 or 3 years ago by sociologists who noted by going through over 3,000 reports of elite athletes in the media, across all media, that what they found is that the vast majority of references to success by Black athletes referred to innate physical ability and strength and ancestry, compared to the vast majority, exact same figures, around about 70% of references to white elite athletes being successful that referred to their industriousness, intellectual prowess, or hard work. Now, I will have ruined watching sport for you now, because you will see this. Having never noticed it before, I now see it all the time. This stuff is absolutely baked into our culture, and there isn't a shred of scientific biological evidence to support it. But our cultural biases quite clearly say Black brawn and white brains. So that is why, touching why I think sport is an important issue in talking about structural racism in the world today. It's very late here, and you must forgive me for having a glass of wine. It's almost midnight, and we're in the middle of a heat wave. It's currently 38 degrees. So let me just briefly talk about another one of the key ideas in the book, which is the concept of racial purity. And I just want to show you a sort of standardized family tree. That's 7 generations with you at the bottom there, and two parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. So an outbred family tree should have approximately 256 people on it. Now, this is a standardized version, which doesn't represent how humans behave at all. This is the type of family tree that we would use historically to try and trace the ancestry of families, but also to trace the pattern and the pathway of diseases through pedigrees. And this is largely how we discovered many genetic diseases back in the 1980s. But the truth is that how this relates to genealogy and how families actually behave through generational time is well, the relationship is not a very clear one, because this is the type of representation, graphical representation, this by the geneticist Graham Coop, of what family trees actually look like, which is that although you have the number of positions that doubles through back as you go back through time, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on, the further back you go, the more that those positions are filled by the same people many times over. And the further you go back through time, you come to a point eventually where everyone in a population has a common ancestor, which may be multiple people, but we talk about the most recent common ancestor as an important concept in population genetics. And then there's a time after that, which we call the identical ancestor point, or the iso point sometimes, which is where every line of every family tree crosses through every individual. Now, I said that a bit quick because it's such a brain scrambling concept, but mathematically and just genealogically true, that it's worth repeating. So basically, if you were alive at the ISA point or the identical ancestors point, and you have living descendants today, then you are the ancestor of everyone today. Now, when we look at something like the European population today, what we find is that the identical ancestors point, the ISA point, occurs at around about 1,000 years ago, right? So 40 generations or so. It means that the entire population of Europe 1,000 years ago is the ancestor of the entire population of Europe today, assuming that they have any living descendants. We assume that there is about 70% to 80% of Europeans at that time have living descendants today. Now, what that means is that the concept of racial purity is an absolute nonsense. And we're drawn to complete narratives which say when you track your family tree back, that you can find, a lineage which may go back to, I don't know, the Pilgrim Fathers if you're American, or it's always royalty if you're European. And this is a sort of attractive thing for one to do when looking at genealogy. Genealogy is the single most popular pastime for Americans. It is the second most popular pastime for British people, the first being gardening. I don't know what that says about us compared to you. But the point is that it doesn't take very long before, as you go back in time, before you realize that the concept of ancestral purity is just a complete nonsense. We are all descended from the same population within only a few generations. And the global ISA point is only a few thousand years BC, before the current era. That is how we think about ancestry. That's how we think about genealogy. And genetic genealogy and genealogy are not quite the same thing. They're divergent through time due to the way that genes are distributed through the formation of sperm and egg. We actually begin to lose genetic information as we go back further through time. So when it comes to things like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and you spin the tube and you pay, like $100 or whatever it is now for them to produce a map like this is my personal 23andMe output. So I'm half Indian. My mother was from Guyana via India, via a 19th century edict known as indenture, which is a form of slavery under British colonial rule in India. And so you see that half of my genome looks Indian and half of my genome looks Northern European, because my dad is from Yorkshire, which is on the north coast of the UK. So that kind of makes sense, but you've got to remember that what these tests are actually showing, rather than tracing your ancestry, they're showing what your DNA looks most like compared to people in the database who are living today. There isn't really a method for identifying where your DNA comes from in the past, partly because of the family tree that I just showed you a minute ago. But the reason I show this is because, well, I wasn't raised by my mother, who was Indian via Guyana in South America. My parents split up when I was very little, and I was in fact raised by my stepmom from a very early age, who I refer to as my mother, because she effectively is. And she's from, well, the Suffolk coast, which is about 70 miles north of here. And yet these types of tests play to a kind of genetic essentialism that I think in genetics, and maybe the geneticists in the room will comment on this, that we were trying to move away from for the last 20 years or so, that your ancestry, that your genetics, that your genome actually says very little about who you are and what your cultural identity is, which is what these sorts of narratives are playing to, and what these sorts of products are playing to. I have no Indian cultural input particularly, because I wasn't raised by Indians. I wasn't raised in India. I've been to India many times, but pretty much always as a tourist. Now, this is a very important idea in far-right people, in the political ideologies of neo-Nazis and white supremacists. And one of the things that I do so that you don't have to is I spend quite a lot of time in racist chat forums, places like, well, this is an example from Stormfront, which is one of the oldest and most popular ultra right-wing white supremacist websites. Now, I track these places in order to monitor the conversations about things like genetics, about ideas like racial purity, because it turns out that these sorts of discussion forums are absolutely dominated. They're obsessed with the concept of racial purity. And just like in the invention of race in the 17th century, they are misusing or misunderstanding deliberately or misrepresenting science and making it into a pseudoscience in order to justify a heavily politicized ideology, in this case, of very extreme forms of racism. Now, I won't deny that what I'm about to show you, that these are dark places, and I really recommend that you do not visit them because it is not worth your own sanity. But there is a sort of slight glimmer of light in these otherwise cesspit places, which is when people report, self-describing neo-Nazis or white supremacists, report that they've done one of these tests, like 23andMe or like Ancestry.com, and they report that they have recent genetic ancestry from people who they absolutely despise, from people who are not Northwestern Europeans or descended immediately from Northwestern Europeans. Here's an example from what was 8chan or 4chan, but there are, I've been following this for many years now, but a couple of years ago, sociologist Aaron Panofsky and his colleagues actually accounted for this very phenomenon in an academic paper, the first sort of formal study of this particular phenomenon. And the first thing to say is that, well, they categorized more than 3,000 responses from Stormfront from people who had suddenly discovered via these ancestry tests that they weren't, pure white, whatever that might mean. And they categorized these responses, the sociologists categorized these responses because they all fitted into a very clear pattern. And spoiler alert, none of the responses included the pattern. I completely need to reassess my entire political worldview. They were all forms of confirmation bias or justification for continuing to hold those beliefs, which is a very common phenomenon amongst conspiracy theorists. Again, now these are sort of funny, but it is a representation of my own privilege to be able to laugh at this. They're people who are very easy to laugh at, but it is important to recognize that it is not predominantly my ancestors or indeed me for whom the racist ideologies of white supremacists was primarily targeted. So this comes again with a sensitivity warning. The first and most popular response to discovering that they didn't have pure white ancestry was try another company for a different result. Now, that obviously sounds absurd. It's not actually absurd as what is going to come. And the reason for this is that different companies do have different panels, different genetic panels that they test against the sample that you send in. So it is possible to get different results depending on the company that you use. However, that is the most rational, even though I think it's unintentionally rational, response that are posted in these forums. The second most popular is 23andMe specifically is run by Jews. Try another company for a different result. What follows that is proper conspiracy theory stuff. Jews who plant false information to sow racial disharmony. Try another company for a different result. I can't compute why Jewish people would plant false information and why they would want to sow racial disharmony, but this is the third most popular response to these sort of discoveries. And then this is a specific example that is emblematic of the types of response that you do see. This one was based on a man discovering that he had recent Ashkenazi Jewish, or significant Ashkenazi Jewish genetic signatures in his genome, to which the response was, look in the mirror, if you don't see a Jew, you're okay. Now this seems to me it somewhat undermines the whole purpose of leaning on science, misunderstood and in fact pseudoscience, to try and prove your racial purity, if you can simply choose to ignore that and decide that you are a white, part of the Aryan race or white supremacist, rather than having actual Jewish ancestry. Now, this is, I'm just going to finish up quickly with a story about milk that many of you may have come across. Now, Richard Spencer there on the left, one of the key white supremacists in the modern era, the coiner of the phrase, the alt-right, And you'll note there that on his Twitter profile, this is from actually last year, he's changed it recently, there is a glass of milk between the words Richard and Spencer. And then the right-hand side is an image from a video that's on YouTube, and this was reported in the New York Times last year, which shows white supremacists and self-describing neo-Nazis downing gallons of milk in order to demonstrate their white supremacy. Now, it's unfortunate this, because this references one of the single best examples of our understanding of the evolution of humans via genetics in the last few years, much of which was done by some of my colleagues at UCL, notably Mark Thomas. And it concerns milk, and it concerns the fact that even though white Europeans, me, and I'm guessing a lot of the people watching right now, can continue to drink milk after weaning, because most people on Earth today and most people on Earth in history can't do that. And this is due to a phenomenon known as lactose persistence. There's a particular sugar in milk which is broken down by an enzyme called lactase. Lactose is the sugar, lactase is the enzyme. Geneticists are really terrible at naming stuff. And this is a gene, the gene that encodes the enzyme tends to get switched off by the age of 5 years old for most people for most of history. So during breastfeeding, it's active, which means you can process milk. But for most people, it gets turned off by the age of 4 or 5, which means that you can't drink milk into adulthood without suffering from diarrhea and various forms of tummy trouble. But we know by looking at the genomes of people who've been dead for thousands of years and looking at the genomes of Europeans and other people from around the world today, that around about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, there was the emergence of a particular mutation in the gene, in the DNA associated with the gene that encodes the enzyme lactase, which meant that people continued to be able to drink milk into adulthood. We now know that this occurred after we were already dairy farming, probably eating things like yogurts and soft cheeses. The sugar lactose is already broken down in soft cheeses and yogurts. But with the emergence of this mutation, which allowed the breakdown of lactose into adulthood, all of a sudden, pastoralists and dairy farmers in Europe had access to a new, rich, fatty, and therefore metabolically important foodstuff, which was raw milk from their cows or sheep or whatever animals they were actually farming at that time. And it spread, that gene spread very quickly through populations in Europe, to the extent that almost all white people today, almost all people of predominantly European descent, can process milk into adulthood. Now, the neo-Nazis got hold of this and decided that this demonstrated their Aryan purity and therefore their white supremacy. It is, of course, nonsensical. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to suggest that being able to drink milk somehow makes you part of the master race, as shown in the still shot from the video on the right-hand side there. Because the punchline to this is that the same mutation emerged in pretty much every population on Earth whose ancestors were significantly involved in pastoralism and dairy farming. And that includes people from Kazakhstan, Ethiopians, the Tutsi in what is now Rwanda, many of the Khoikhoi or Khoisan tribesmen from Southern Africa, and basically everywhere on Earth where dairy farming was part of their agricultural and therefore cultural evolution. And that's not just milk from cows or sheep or goats, but also camel milk from pastoralists in the Middle East. So I suppose, you know, again, it is easy to mock these people, but part of these types of conversations, when people politically significant people like Richard Spencer are using this as emblematic usurping or co-opting or marshalling of really misunderstood, misrepresented science in order to demonstrate their own racist ideologies. This is exactly what happened in The Origin of Race back in the 17th and 18th century. I want to finish now so we can get to questions, which are always much more interesting than me just waffling on. So let me just finish by saying that, you know, science was an integral part of the invention of race in the 18th century, but the trajectory of science has been to dispel the biological concept of race completely. And that I think is really worth celebrating. But, you know, scientists are not always that great at talking about the political ramifications of their research. And I think we need to be better at doing that. And we're also not necessarily people who know our own history very well. Because I think, and I argue in the book, that science is one of the most powerful tools to undermine racist ideologies, because we have demonstrated through our trajectory, through the trajectory of our history, the fact that race is not encoded, does not tally with our biological understanding of evolution or human variation. So let me just finish by saying that, you know, race is real because we perceive it, and racism is very real because we enact it. Neither have foundations in science. Our job, my job, or everyone's job, especially for scientists and especially for geneticists, is to contest the bastardization of this science to support racist ideologies. I'm basically saying that, you know, you cannot have my tools to support your bigotry. And so I encourage people to be better informed about our own history and about the complexities of genetics. Some scientists talk about how science is apolitical. Science has never been apolitical and never will be as long as it is done by people. Science is structurally racist in the same way that society is structurally racist, because science is part of society. It is not exempt from the same principles that culture is built upon. And in fact, science is an integral part of the creation of race within the last few centuries. And this quote is the one I want to leave you with, because we do live in racist societies, and it is not enough to be non-racist. With science as your toolkit, with science as your weapon, we have the capability of being anti-racist. And so thank you for listening, and maybe now we can talk about some questions. Okie dokie.
Cool. There we go. There's a bit of a lag. There we go. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It looks like we have a few questions coming in so far. Feel free to keep asking them. We are supposed to wrap up at about the hour mark, but if we go a little over, all the better. We're learning more together. So let's dive in.
Okay, it's not Scotch, it's a Pinot Grigio. So
Pinot Grigio. Also, for those asking, I am a bit new to Crowdcast. I wasn't sure how to manipulate the screen so that you could see Adam a little better during the presentation, but it'll be better next time. This first question, it says, apologies, I haven't read your book yet. However, it is, of course, on my bookshelf and my next thing to read. I was just wondering if you would be able to do a quick delve into the origins of the construction of race from the 17th century. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So that is the first chapter in the book. And so I'll do it briefly because I can talk about, I've got like a whole lecture on that one single question. But prejudice and bigotry has existed throughout human history, but there's very little evidence that it is predicated on the racial lines that we recognize today or that we discuss socially today using folk taxonomies until the 17th century. There's kind of one example before that, which is from the Islamic slave era, described by the philosopher stroke scientist Avicenna from the 12th century, I think it is from memory. So there is plenty of bigotry, but it tends to be founded on religious, cultural, geographical, or language-based prejudice. And it, dates back to, we've got evidence of discussion of pigmentation in humans in the very earliest European or Western texts, such as in the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. But you only really see the classification of people with the emergence of European expansionism and European colonialism in the 17th century and onwards. And these two things happen absolutely at the same time. As Europeans are expanding, particularly into sub-Saharan Africa, we simultaneously see the emergence of the birth of science itself, which is a sort of 17th century phenomenon, but also the first types of biological classifications, primarily by Carl Linnaeus, whose taxonomic system we still use today, so Homo sapiens, genus and species, in which he includes descriptions of humans, which he subcategorizes into 5 distinct races of people, which are broadly the 5 races of people that we still colloquially used today. Now, pigmentation is the primary determinant in his descriptions in his major work, which is Systemae Naturae. He talks about black people, red skins for indigenous Americans, yellow skins for people of East Asian descent, and white for Europeans. And following on from those basic physiological descriptions, which are vastly inaccurate, and we know that there's more pigmentation variation within Africa than in the rest of the world put together now. That's modern work by people like Brenna Henn and Nina Jablonski and Sarah Tishkoff, who's at New York. So not only were they scientifically inaccurate, you've got to remember that a lot of the people doing this never left their drawing rooms, but were basing this on secondhand reports and meeting the occasional people, often subjugated or enslaved people. So these descriptions were not merely taxonomy, they weren't merely classification, they were always hierarchical taxonomies. And see if you can guess who's at the top of that hierarchy. In every single case, without question, it is white Europeans. So what we have is the invention of race that hasn't existed previously, that is coincident with the with European expansions and the age of plunder, as a means of justifying the subjugation and enslavement of people. Now, when I've talked about this in the past, but especially in scientific forums, some people can sort of they get a bit twitchy about this and say, well, where's the evidence for this? This is not my theory. This is standard race history. This is absolutely textbook stuff. I literally have textbooks on my shelf over there, many of which say exactly this thing. So you have the invention of race as we currently recognize it is absolutely entwined with the justification of subjugation as a political ideology during this era of colonialism. So that's what I mean. So science is structurally racist from its origins, because we have the birth of this subject, which at first is just classification, which evolves into anthropology, which evolves into genetics. And it's only in the late 20th century that genetics actually begins to resolve some of the pseudoscientific justifications that have come before it. And it is genomics, ultimately, which says that human variation is not capitulated in the genome in the way that we recognize it as folk taxonomies for race. It's a long answer. I mean, like I said, I could talk about that one question for about 4 hours without breathing, but I think, that would take us into the middle of the night.
That's a part 2 for another day. We have another question, actually from Dr. Jennifer Raff, who I believe you know. She says, Adam, are there any other genetic traits that neo-Nazis or white supremacists claim as shorthand markers of superiority besides lactose persistence? Wasn't proportion of Neanderthal ancestry a thing for them a while ago? And is that still true?
Yeah, it's a great question. For those of you who don't know, so Jennifer Raff is a geneticist, stroke anthropologist at University of Kansas, and a good friend and colleague of mine. And she's got a book coming. I'm just going to pimp her book, which comes out next year, which is called Origins, and it's about the peopling of the Americas, based on a lot of her research and working with indigenous communities up and down the Americas. Now, yeah, so some of you will know that in the last 10 years, it is now, the genetics, particularly looking at ancient genetics, so the DNA of people who've been dead for tens of thousands of years, has become a sort of still very difficult but standard part of understanding human origins. And part of that narrative is like 10 years ago, we found that Neanderthals are not really a separate species from us. We interbred with them. They are our ancestors in the same way that Homo sapiens are. And most white people carry something between 1 and maybe 2.5% Neanderthal DNA. Now, I have it. It comes up in your 23andMe. You have it. Jenny has it. Now, again, this as a sort of uniqueness to white Europeans was seen in certain communities as being justification for the separation of white Europeans from the rest of humanity, and therefore the imposition of superiority for that very same thing. Yeah, and again, it is a complete nonsense. There are some characteristics that modern humans have which appear to be derived from our ancestors' sexual relations with Neanderthals. They are also our ancestors, so I shouldn't separate them like that. And you know, we occasionally come across particular genetic prevalences or predispositions to certain conditions or behaviors, and maybe recently in the last couple of weeks, one has been susceptibility to COVID infection. But again, you know, does that somehow segregate a population? No, it does not. Does it demonstrate ancestral purity or a lineage which excludes the rest of the people of the world? No, it does not. The isopoint for humanity is only a few thousand years, and comes much later, tens of thousands of years after the last Neanderthals died off, which was about 40,000 years ago in Europe. So I guess you know, using that sort of justification is commonplace. We see it all the time with people who want to support a specific ideology. It's a classic example of the psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. But I think it's even better explained by the quotation from Jonathan Swift from 1721, and I'm going to mangle it because he says he wrote it in 18th century language. But it's basically the principle that you can't reason a person out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into. So in a sense, you know, what is the point in arguing with these people? Well, because then rational discourse is not part of their mindset. But anyway, you know, it's still worth beating the drum about that. So thanks, Jenny, for that question.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Jennifer. That was awesome. We're just now hitting our hour mark, so I'm going to make this our final question. I know we won't get to everyone, but you all asked a lot of really wonderful, interesting questions. Thank you for that. But I'm going to, this kind of ties into where you just left off with the last question. So our final one is going to be it's from Max. He says, your discussion reminds me there is a strong attraction to pseudoscience beliefs that do not directly align to racism, but share that essentialism. I think of how astrology was first linked to phrenology, and it requires one to have a kind of boutique silliness. I wonder your thoughts on whether pushing back against pseudoscience generally should be more explicitly part of anti-racist movements, or if it is too ancillary, despite being the ingredient of ignorance that can lead to such ideas.
Yeah, it's a really good idea that you're expressing there, Max. And you know, I got to be really clear about this. I'm not pretending that this is a book that is going to fix racism, right? Prejudice, as I said a minute ago, bigotry and prejudice are universal characteristics, and people find new ways to justify or to express that bigotry. And currently, we're in the third or fourth century of it being very specifically focused around, well, primarily pigmentation, but subsequently these racialized folk taxonomies that are part of our everyday descriptions of people. There's a sort of emerging phenomenon which is really been exacerbated by social media, where the voices of actual racists in some cases, or people who have old-fashioned, non-racist but somewhat stereotyped views about different people of the world or different ancestries, and that's why sport, I think, is important in this discussion, get amplified and get polarized. And we know very well that social media is a hugely polarizing sort of phenomenon that hasn't existed in previous generations. And so you do get the amplification of these types of voices in ways that is novel and different. I guess difficult to know how to contend. I guess being aware of the concept of confirmation bias, being aware of the fact that our prejudices are so personally and culturally baked in, is part of that process. one of the most rewarding things about writing this book is having people who are committed non-racists, who don't have a sort of personal racist animosity towards anyone, who turn around and say, God, I used to think that about black sprinters or East African long distance runners, or I used to think that about, the success of Jewish people in pursuits which are predominantly intellectual in their boundaries. And there's an aspect to this. I'm not sure I'm answering Max's question, but there's an aspect to this, which is we see some of these ideas as being, well, sometimes we refer to these as positive attribute racism, because who doesn't want to be faster or more muscly or sportier or more intelligent, better at chess, or whatever that racialized category is, or the stereotype of East Asian people being better at mathematics. Now, the stats are quite clear on these things. East Asian people are better at mathematics. Is that biologically encoded? There isn't a shred of evidence that that is the case. These are phenomena that are explained culturally and not via genetics. And the science that underlies this is really super, super complex, to the extent that, well, Jennifer Raff and Tuli Lappanainen probably understand it far better than I do. But what we see in social media and what we see in the expression of these types of ideas by people who are given a voice, given a platform by social media, is the expression of misunderstood, extremely complex science. And we see it in the mainstream media as well. We see it in prominent voices on social media and in the mainstream media. And the truth is that they're just not right. And I think the biggest tool, the biggest weapon in contesting this kind of bigotry is having better arguments than the people who are saying things that are not correct. I know that sounds like a really dumbass thing to say, but it's so obviously and overtly true. We win by having better arguments. And so what the book is an attempt to do is to equip people with the most up-to-date, the best discussion of some of the most complex science that has ever existed, in order that when those sorts of conversations come up around the dinner table, in the pub, or on Twitter, or on Facebook, or in elections, or wherever, you can actually sit back and say, you know what, you can't have science to justify your stereotype or your racism, because that's not what the science says. It doesn't say that black people are better sprinters. It doesn't say that Jewish academic success is biologically encoded. It doesn't say those things at all. It doesn't mean that those things aren't superficially correct, but a true scientist goes beyond the first observation of any data, whether it's accurate or not, and says, well, if this is a real phenomenon, I want to know what the reason for this is. And sometimes people just aren't skeptical enough. You just got to keep going until science is the pursuit of truth. It is not the arrival at truth.
Well said. A really great place to leave off, I think. Thank you again, everyone who's watching. I shared the link so that you can purchase your own copy of How to Argue with a Racist if you do not have one already, the US edition that just came out. It's in the chat. It's also a lovely green button in the video chat. So pick it up, read it, inform yourself so you can continue making those arguments with people who need to hear them. And then Adam, any final thoughts or anything you'd like to share before we sign off?
No, not really. Like I said, it's an absolute pleasure being back at the Strand, even though I'm in my 30-degree house right now, and it's so hot. It's so hot here. So I apologize for that, but I hope New York is, as I so fondly love it, and I'll be there as soon as I can.
Love to have you. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone watching. I hope you have a lovely evening. You're reading wonderful things, and we will see you next time.